Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my standard review of the new Tamron 28-200mm F2.8-5.6. This is what they call a DI3, which means it is designed for mirrorless, in this case for full-frame Sony mirrorless. And also it has their RXD, which is their rapid stepping motor focus system. All good things, as we're going to see in just a moment. And so today I'm here to give you my standard review of this lens that is vying to become your new choice for a all-in-one or travel type lens. And of course it thus becomes a direct competitor to the Sony 24-240mm f3.5 to 6.3 OS lens. And I will be drawing some direct comparisons to that lens. However, I will be following up with a subsequent head-to-head video that gives you a little bit more information on how they compare in various metrics. Every super zoom lens, all-in-one lens, is a series of compromises. With a prime lens, a manufacturer can focus on optimizing for one particular focal length. And in many zoom lenses, for example, I recently reviewed the Sigma 100-400mm. In this case, while there is a 4x zoom range, it's all within the telephoto end. And so while there is going to be some variance, they're able to optimize and deal with the typical flaws that you have to deal with, or challenges, I should say, you have to deal with a telephoto lens. In a lens like this, however, you're going from wide angle to telephoto with everything in between, and so it requires some serious compromises. In this case, Tamron has kind of opted to put a lot of those compromises out front, in that they've taken some off the wide end, 28mm instead of 24mm. They've taken a little off the telephoto end, 200 rather than 240mm. And so a little over a 7x zoom range instead of a 10x zoom range. They've also opted to not include an optical stabilizer in the lens, but instead rely on Sony's in-body image stabilization. So as we're going to see, at least one of those choices really pays off in a number of important ways. The other one, not so much. But we'll explore all of that as a part of today's review. Now, if you want all the details, all the information, I recommend that you check out the definitive review, as this review really hits more the high points, that other really delves into the details. I should also note that I am filming right now on the lens on a Sony A9, and so you get a sense of not only the look of the 4K video footage you can get with it, but it also gives you a sense of how good a job it's doing at tracking my face. So as I noted, Tamron has elected to put some of its compromises up front, including an abbreviated focal range. Byproduct of that is that not only do we get vastly improved image qualities, we'll see in just a moment, but there also is an aperture advantage as compared to the Sony, or by comparison to another equivalent lens that I reviewed not that long ago, the Canon RF 24-240mm. And so in the case of the Tamron, throughout the focal range, across most of the focal range, you'll find that the aperture advantage is anywhere from 2/3 to a full stop, and it's only at the very end where they settle out at f5.6 on the Tamron versus f6.3 for either the Canon or the Sony lens. And in fact, when even wide open, the Canon lens is at f4, for example, while the Tamron is at f2.8. So the good news with the Tamron is that in many situations, you actually get a lot more light gathering. In some cases, twice as much light gathering. For around 70mm, for example, you're going to get twice as much light on this lens as you would with the Sony. That's a pretty huge advantage in a lot of situations, since one of the liabilities of a lens like this is that they do tend to have slower maximum apertures. And in fact, this particular lens, which Tamron calls the A071 is their code for it, the A071 actually still has you at 100mm, you're still at f4.5. And so, fairly good for a lens like this. Now, when it comes to the build and the design, in many cases, I'm kind of criticizing Tamron because it's a fairly bare bones approach. In this case, however, the Sony equivalent lens, while costing around $300 more, doesn't really provide a lot extra in terms of features. On the Sony lens, like the Tamron, there are no switches or dials on the lens, just the two rings, the manual focus ring and then the zoom ring. And in this case, the Tamron zoom ring works a little bit more smoothly. Both of them have some degree of weather sealing, but the Tamron seems to have better sealing with a much thicker gasket at the rear. It has a flooring coating on the front element, which the Sony lacks, and a series of internal seals. And so I think that Tamron wins on that front. It also wins on the front of being a little bit shorter, not by a wide margin, but it is approximately 2 millimeters shorter, and it is 7 millimeters smaller in diameter. It also ends up weighing out about 200 grams less. And so the Tamron lens, it's going to weigh in at about 575.5 grams compared to 785 grams for the Sony lens. And so I would say, as far as the build and handling goes, I actually prefer the Tamron. I think its build is just as good. I think its weather sealing is probably better. And the only thing that is missing here is the optical stabilizer. And that is somewhat of a big deal because Tamron is elected to go with the in-body image stabilization of most newer Sony bodies to provide the image stabilization. And certainly it does help. There's no question about it. In my test, however, you're going to get at the longer telephoto end of the zoom range, you're going to get something like 2.5 stops of assistance, whereas an in-lens stabilizer is going to give you closer to 4 stops of assistance. The byproduct of that is that you have to be just a little bit more careful in lighting conditions, because if you're in variable lighting conditions and your shutter speed drops below a certain threshold, you're probably going to find that you're going to get less keepers, more motion blur that you'll see on images. So as a rule of thumb, I would recommend that you keep this lens at 1/100th of a second or faster. And if you shoot at slower shutter speeds than that, you might want to take a couple to make sure that you got one that doesn't have motion blur. One thing that does help to offset this a little bit is the fact that the Tamron has such better light transmission throughout the zoom range that it does tend to be a little bit easier to keep the shutter speed up relative to the Sony. However, that is what I would consider the greatest kind of physical liability, is the missing optical stabilizer and relying on IBIS instead. Now, fortunately, there are no such crutches when it comes to the autofocus performance. As I noted at the beginning of this review, the RXD focus motor is one I'm really a fan of. I've liked it in all the applications thus far, and this lens is no exception. It gives you very fast, very quiet, very smooth autofocus, which is helped somewhat by the fact that Sony does own a stake in Tamron, and so as a byproduct of that, Tamron actually licenses Sony's focus technology as opposed to trying to reverse engineer it, as they have to do on Canon or Nikon. What we have seen as a result of this is better autofocus performance on Sony. In fact, the Tamron autofocus is just as good as any Sony lens that I have used. And that's true also here, with very quick, very smooth focus, and as we're going to see, very quiet focus pulls. Let's take a look at how it performs for video. So clearly that is a really great performance. And in fact, you might have noticed at 28 millimeters on the wide end, those are perhaps the fastest focus pulls that I've seen. I mean, you can see just how quick focus is, and it's even quicker still when shooting in shooting stills. In AFC mode, it's basically instantaneous. And even on the telephoto end, while there's a little bit of slowdown, which is typical for a lens like this, by the way, it is still really fast. Fast enough, in fact, that I was able to shoot some action with a fair degree of accuracy. And so while I don't think a lens like this is a replacement for a dedicated telephoto lens, you know, it's a jack of all trades. And so in a pinch, I think it'll track action actually fairly well, as you can see from this sequence. Beyond that, however, I also found that it performed very well for IAF and thus for getting accurately focused portraits. I had my son take a series of portraits at a few different focus distances, along with a variety of focal lengths. He is by far not a professional photographer, and so I had him giving me feedback as he went, since I served as the subject, to see how IAF tracking went. And fortunately, it tracked perfectly, and when I reviewed the images, they were all perfectly focused. So Kudos to Tamron for giving us a great focus system that has worked well in all the situations that I've put it in. Every now and then you'll get that typical issue on Sony to where a foreground object, the lens prefers to focus on the background until you do something to bring focus forward. But as you've heard me say before, that's something I've seen on a lot of lenses, and so certainly not unique to this one. Overall, this is a great focus experience here. I'm also incredibly impressed by how good the image quality is. I have to admit that my expectations are a little low for a lens like this. I'm accustomed to, with a lens like this, having to really stop a lens down to f8 or so to get reasonably sharp images, but often if you zoom into the fine details, they're a little bit mushy and blurred because, as I said, there are a lot of compromises involved. Tamron's choice to abbreviate the focal range has given them the flexibility of producing a remarkably strong optical performer. In fact, at 28mm, I was shocked at my very first shot, a wide open 28mm f2.8 shot, when I zoomed in and I found great detail even on a 42 megapixel A7R Mark III. Furthermore, when I went to do my chart test and I compared it to either the Sony or the Canon 24 to 240mm, it was fairly shocking how much better the Tamron was. That's true also in that it has far less distortion because it doesn't go all the way to 24mm. It has less vignette, and it has none of the mechanical vignette where, you know, they have to go so wide and there's so much distortion that some of the image gets cropped before you actually do the, you know, the actual lens profile is applied to smooth things out. As a byproduct, while there isn't yet a profile for RAW files, I didn't find I missed it all that much because there wasn't a whole lot of distortion or strong vignette there to begin with. And what was there, I was able to manually correct fairly easily if I desired to do so. Equally impressive was the image quality as I began to go throughout the zoom range. And as I compared it again and again, the Tamron always compared out favorably. It would not only have a larger maximum aperture at the equivalent focal lengths, but it would be much sharper across the frame. And at 200mm, it destroys the Sony at 240mm, and it is noticeably better than the Canon at 240mm. And so Tamron has done a great job with this. Beyond that, chromatic aberrations are well controlled. You'll see just a tiny bit of purple fringing at the 28mm in this shot, for example, which was the worst case scenario I saw. I was unable to produce basically any longitudinal chromatic aberrations in any of my telephoto shots, and I couldn't really find much of any noticeable lateral chromatic aberrations in my landscape shots. So all of this adds up to remarkably sharp and detailed images that don't only look good at a global level, but actually look good at a pixel level as well. And that really is shocking to me. Flare resistance is fairly good. In fact, the only liability that I saw optically is that in some situations when you have bright circular highlights or bright highlights and out of focus highlights in an image, you will definitely see some very strong, what they call onion bokeh or concentric circles in those circular highlights, which is pretty distracting if you're someone that notices those kinds of things, as I am. In other situations where there weren't bright highlights, the bokeh, while not stunning, was much better to look at. So I would recommend, just being wise and don't use the lens to its disadvantages, but put it in situations where it can succeed. Overall, however, I think that this is going to be a great option for travel, for hiking, or for an all-in-one lens because it really makes you compromise relatively little when it comes to the image quality. And then it has great autofocus, obviously a very flexible zoom range that allows you to go from this in the scene to this while having great image quality across all of that range. All told, this is a very impressive lens. And I see very little reason to choose the Sony over it unless you really feel like you need the extra zoom range on it or the optical stabilizer. But for most people in most situations, the Tamron is the much better choice. And so it's an easy recommendation from me. And I've already put in a request for my next trip to Tamron to get me a loaner of this lens because it is so practical, so great for a situation like that. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find a linkage to my full text review and a lot of extra information there. There's linkage to an image gallery if you want to check out photos. Also buying links if you want to get in a pre-order for yourself or order one for yourself. And thank you as always to those of you that use these links that help to support this channel and keep it going. There's also links to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.